Hello and welcome to Amazing Meetings by Bartosz Zielesznik and Louis Nichrini, the international podcast for managers, coaches and facilitators. Hello there, it's Bartosz and welcome to episode 9. Tonight we play with food with Sophie Yotova.
The way people interact with food is very similar to the way people interact with all kinds of things they have certain convictions about.
Sophie is a food artist, TEDx speaker, certified eating psychology coach, and the founder and CEO of Foodie Boulevard, a global social enterprise that teaches kids and grown-ups to become real-life superheroes by using food as a superpower on and off the dining table.
I wanted to leave work and create value for people that lasts, that helps them connect with their children or build a relationship with their spouse or unleash their inner artist.
We encourage you to do so much more with your food.
Create a self-portrait, a medical self-portrait that corresponds to your idea of who you are with what you've got here. But bear in mind, everything must be eaten at the end of this journey. So there is no food can be wasted here.
How to start playing with your food. That's Amazing Meetings with Bartosz, Louis and Sophie.
So Sophie, I want to tell you something. So my wife and I have been married for almost 12 years now. And we had a discussion the other day about, a moment that you love someone or a moment that this is going to get really serious.
Yeah.
So what happened was I went to a wedding with her, which was a family wedding on her side. And the wedding was on the Saturday. And on the Sunday, we sat down for Sunday dinner, which in South Africa is a braai. It's a barbecue and everything. Mm-hmm. And the family had fillets on the open fire. And I sat down with fillet, and her sister made berry and red wine reduction of that. And I just kind of this is a family if you can eat here, you can live here, you can love here. So
right?
I sat and I just kind of went with that. So we're talking about food today and falling in love with food and all of that. Have you got some good food stories about how you fell in love and how you realized food is going to be the thing that's going to take you forward?
I love this story because one thing that it shows clearly is that food is just so much more than calories and nutrients and fat diets and those huge corporations. Food is the context. It is our shared humanity. It is a space for connecting. It is a place where you discover so much more about who you are and who you can be than what maybe your environment and social conditioning leads you to believe. And my personal food stories, the one that I love, they are pretty mixed in terms of emotion because I didn't come to food from the most optimistic place. The reason I got into this space is because I have struggled with a pretty debilitating eating disorder since I was a teenager. And food, for me, it had become prison that was literally dominating my social life, my sense of worth, and it had transformed into this monster that was living my life instead of me. And that had been going on for a little over a decade without me actually being able to take a step back and kind of realize that this was going on. I had just accepted all of this as something normal. I had been taking it for granted for so long that I didn't even pay attention to it anymore. Until in 2015, my grandmother was diagnosed with a pretty rare type of cancer, and she passed away in less than a month, basically. And this was when my eating disorder got really bad. And the reason I think I've kind of tried to backtrack what happened a few times, and the reason I think I started looking at food from a different place at this time was the fact that she didn't stand the chance to fight for her life because she had been hiding her symptoms, and she was too afraid to face something that could have been, I don't know if it could have been cured, but she didn't have to fall prey to her fears. And I had been doing that for such a long time that I realized, okay, this is not like an addiction that you can learn to live without. When food has such a central space in your life, doesn't matter where you're from, what your life story is, what your, like the amount in your bank account, none of this matters. Food is on your table your whole life. Like every single human being who ever lived can relate to food as something tangible in their life. And I realized that I could either choose to approach food with fear, like something that's supposed to be trivial and mundane, something that's supposed to bring you joy. You know, the experience that you had when you realized your wife was, you know, your person. This didn't bring me any joy. This made me feel like a worthless human who had zero willpower. And I realized, like, no, there must be more to life than that. And for the first time in my life, I actually approached food with curiosity instead of fear. And this was 5 years ago. And what happened then was that I began to play with it. The very thing that had ruled my life for over a decade, I chose to engage with it in a fun and creative way and see what else is out there. You know, I decided to ask the question, okay, what if everything that was happening in this context wasn't happening to me, but was happening for me? What could I take from that? What if I could actually create some sort of value? Because here's the kicker. I've also never had sense of smell in my entire life. And I don't know what it feels like. Like this coffee, nothing. Flowers, nothing. Public restrooms, none of it. So I've always approached food from a super different space. So this is how I came to it, and I think that got a little bit way too long, but I hope I kind of created a context that's useful.
That established the context very well. I absolutely love the fact how you use the heaviest artillery first, completely blowing us out of our seats. I'm not sure you can follow up a story like that with a relevant question, but let's try. Let's give it a shot. Okay, when I was a little boy, my idea of playing with food was probably somewhat different to what you're doing with your guests and the people who you support through your food and play workshops. That's how I sort of branded them.
I love that, by the way.
Most parents, I think, you know, when you're around the table and they sort of see their kids throwing their food around, they would very sharply say, eat your meat.
Yeah.
You know,
exactly.
You can skip the potatoes, but eat your meat. That's generally like 2,000 years of Polish history summarized in one sentence. But this is my childhood, so I'm not really. I don't think I'm really wired to be playing with food. I think there's one thing you're sort of wired for is efficiency.
Yeah. Well, I don't think many of us are wired to be comfortable playing with food, because even when I was a child, and still to this day, playing with food has been considered as something disrespectful. And that makes sense, right? Because like so many people around the globe still die of starvation, and playing with food is no joke. You know, it's not something that you can afford to do, because it shows that you have no appreciation for what this like gem, this wealth does for you. But here's something that I understood gradually. You know, people usually, whatever the thing in question is, we don't react necessarily to the core, the essence of a certain thing. We react to our convictions, our beliefs about that thing. So when people say it's disrespectful to play with food, the premise is that it's wasteful. The very act of playing with food is wasteful. Whereas what I do and what I try to inspire both kids and grown-ups to embrace is to engage with food in a fun and creative way that's not only not wasteful, but also that helps them cultivate respect and a relationship with it beyond the dining table. Because I like to say that food is like a Swiss Army knife. You can kind of, carry it in your pocket for years and use it for one single thing. But then if you get curious about it and start playing around with it, you sort of realize that there's a bunch of different things that you can do with it. And once I started approaching food with curiosity, I realized that it could instead be used as a context for people to develop skills that have nothing to do with cooking and eating. Just because people perceive martial arts as something that you use to cultivate discipline and resilience doesn't mean that those skills cannot be applied in every other area of your life. And this has been my sort of read of food and our interaction with food as well, because when you engage with it in this way, you create a mindful and meaningful relationship with it that helps you strengthen your creativity in a way that results in a delicious meal at the end, but also has this lasting impact in terms of the skills that you acquire in the process. The essence of what I do is basically you play with the food, you do your thing, you kind of sharpen your abstract thinking, you do different activities, but then you transform whatever you played around with, this playground becomes a space to create a meal that you eat at the end of the whole process. So there's no food that's wasted. And I think this is the key difference from what we used to perceive as playing with food. There is no wasting of food here. There is no disrespect. It's actually a whole different story.
I want to say I find it interesting that you've taken a taboo, and it's like Bart just described. It's something that is really frowned upon, and just kind of given it a new context. And as a coach, I'm listening to this and I'm getting excited, and I'm wondering what type of taboos do you come across in your workshops as well that people don't want to do or don't want to talk about in relationships or in teams or in your the team that you're part of. The taboos that they don't want to address that actually come to the fore. And as they working with the food and doing the wrong thing in inverted commas, that something else actually gets birthed from that.
Yeah, thank you for that question, because honestly, I'm going to go a few steps back here and relate to something I said in the beginning, which was that I don't feel like I belong where I am right now, because in the environment I'm physically located and the majority of the people that I've worked with throughout the years, they haven't really been able to zoom out and see the bigger picture and see food as a context and observe that the way people kind of interact with food is very similar to the way people interact with all kinds of things they have certain convictions about. So basically, we go back to the very fact that unless you're able to check your all of your prejudices at the door and approach a certain subject with an open mind and with curiosity, you are unable to evolve, to grow, to improve, to heal, to upgrade. None of this stuff is possible. And whether we are talking about a certain situation in the corporate world where there are some conflicts in a team, or the people are just stuck and cannot innovate because they are trying to do more of what doesn't work, unless people realize that sometimes the better question is to ask why not instead of why, they just the game is over. It's dead on arrival. So this is what I try to do with food. I introduce this pretty weird space for people to learn from. And this is what makes them a little bit less critical and a little bit more maybe willing to risk it and do the wrong thing, just because the stakes are super low. And what happens is that at the end of like a session or like a workshop, people come out of it with a little bit of a different idea of what it means to do the wrong thing and what the consequences of that could be.
Oh my word. I'm just, my head is going at 1,000 miles per hour now, because this is essentially the most creative thing I heard all month. Like,
oh my God.
Honestly, yeah, I'm just, because you break so many stereotypes here. It's quite impossible to actually place this in a context. And I noticed that context is a big and a loaded word for you. And my personal relationship with food has been sort of up and down. A while ago, I suffered from like a bacterial infection that literally turned my diet upside down. But it was only after that I realized that it is really important what you put in, because it does all sorts of different things to your body. Long story short, I've recovered now, and I'm not very proud to say, but I'm back to my old plumpy sort of self, So I gained, I think, 8 kilos, and I think this is the context for food. So how fat does it make me look?
Yeah.
How good does it make me feel? How charged does it make me with all those calories? And there's good and bad. There's all sorts of like different valuations that come into play. And it is only now that I'm realizing how complicated this whole thing is. So to a person like myself, who's sort of back in the old rut, struggling not to eat that Kit Kat bar. If you listen to the previous episode, you know where the joke is, but not struggling, like really and honestly struggling. Where would you start? What's the sort of advice you would give to someone who is, doesn't really understand what their relationship with food is?
Yeah, so this is one of those things where the more you learn, the more you know, the more kind of you realized that there is this huge universe of interconnected concepts and relationships between like the different modalities in your head that don't really seem to have too much in common, but they are actually like this perfect system that would make sense if you were to just like, again, zoom out and look at the big picture. Because for me, my official expertise is as an eating psychology coach. So I don't have the expertise of a nutritionist who would be able to say, for this kind of person, this kind of diet would work. No, because I realized that it's sometimes useful to have a more general overview of everything and be able to spot different types of problems that people are experiencing so that you can then direct them to the right kind of specialist. And what I realized was that, so in terms of how people come to the realization that maybe they need to pay more attention to what they eat, I am still to meet a person who has proactively decided that, okay, so I'm done with my unhealthy habits. Now from tomorrow on, I'm just going to clean it up. Everything's going to be perfect. People start hitting roadblocks. Either their health suffers, or something in their personal life, like psychologically or emotionally, they're experiencing some turbulence that kind of turns their head toward this one like small thing that's the food they eat on a daily basis, and they start going about it in a little bit of a different way and kind of start making connections. Okay, so if I'm eating that kind of food, my energy levels go up, and then I feel more clear-headed, I have more energy. But then if I eat this, then I feel crappy the day after, and they start making those connections. So I have been studying the industry, like the health and wellness industry, for 5 years now, and what I've come to realize is that the problem is that the bottom line, the fundament of everything is that people don't have a relationship with food beyond the dining table. And they try to put band-aids on gunshot wounds, and they wonder, why is this not working? Well, let me get into a little bit of statistics here. The global wellness industry, I think right now, is estimated at about a little bit over $4 trillion US. And at the same time, the global obesity rates have tripled since the 70s. So clearly something is just not adding up. We are doing so much more of stuff that's not working, and we're wondering why. And this is exactly why I approached this whole thing from a completely different perspective. And I went like, okay, there seems to be nothing more to lose. Why not just focus on having fun first? Playing around, enjoying ourselves, and take it from there. And this is why before I start asking the deep questions, but like, how do you feel? And how was your childhood? Did you have a parent who forced you to eat your broccoli or whatever? I just tell people, okay, let's just play around with it and see what happens.
So Sophie, so if I can ask you, you say people come and people make a radical or people take a turn in their lives because of things that happen. It's medical, it's a pregnancy, it's something like that. There's a moment that causes people to change. If I can ask you, what are some of the things that our listeners can be on the lookout for that they might not even be realizing now is indicators of things, not working on the inside?
Yeah, so this is a very good question. One of the things that people can do is I'm not going to go into tools and tactics because I would traditionally say, having a food journal is great, but this requires a lot of engagement. And if people are in the eye of the storm, if they are suffering and they are not able to realize it yet and distance themselves from this, giving them tools is maybe not the best thing. But what I try to tell them is just to pay attention. Like, don't necessarily try to change your habits right away. Pay attention. What's different? If you've been doing the same thing for a long time and all of a sudden this same habit, this type of eating behavior, this choice of food is starting to make you feel different, either physically or psychologically, pay attention what happens around that time. Maybe your stress levels are elevated in your work life, or maybe your relationship is, struggling, somebody inside a relationship is struggling, or maybe, your stomach is all of a sudden just like in this huge knot and you're experiencing like some sort of discomfort that you never felt before. It's those little symptoms in the body that can direct your attention to this area that maybe is asking for your attention. And the reason I'm saying that is because I think it was exactly 2 years ago to the day that I suffered a pretty scary burnout, which was preceded by literally 9 months of physical symptoms that I neglected. And the moment I started paying attention, and this included stuff in my eating behaviors as well, the moment I started paying attention was the moment I realized that something needs maybe a different approach. And I didn't have the answers. For a long time, I made the mistake of always going for hunting for the answers. Like, what should I do? Like right now, I need the answer. And I'm just realizing this year actually that asking the right questions at the right time is where it all begins. Because otherwise you may get the answer, but if you're not ready to hear it and follow up on it, there's no use of it.
So the quote says, change your questions, change your life. So that's really one place, is just to ask different questions. So we are in about 100 days into COVID-19. The effects is people are sitting at home. Bachelor's fridges, the light is working overtime now, open and close, and it's a Kit Kat, and it's a different eating habits, and there's a lot of emotional things that's different now in the uncertainty. Any advice to people sitting at home, working from home, some tricks and tools, something they should be on the lookout for in this time of growth in very physical terms at home?
Yeah. Well, what I've realized is that many people, there are certain types of issues that many people face in this context. And one of them is that so many of us are forced to spend so much more time in the kitchen than usual, because for many people, eating out was like just the way they consume their food. or ordering in, which is still an option, but people tend to kind of be afraid, what that would mean. There's so many complications when it comes to our interaction with food in the midst of COVID. And I have also, with the same magnitude, heard people who have discovered that cooking actually relaxes them. And they had no clue that was the case before this, because they essentially weren't forced in those circumstances. So what I can say is that maybe, we were just catapulted into this new normal that requires us to process things differently and to kind of look for that opportunity in disguise. And maybe, as trivial as it sounds, spending some time in the kitchen in a way that people didn't do that before, in essence, playing around with their food and getting creative with their food, and maybe just trying new things, trying, blind tastings with their spouse, or challenging their child to maybe pick their favorite fruit and tell a story about it, or give it associate with a certain emotion. Doesn't matter. As long as you force your mind to make new connections, you're kind of essentially getting out of this, this stuck sense of, same old, doing, going to the store or just getting in the kitchen, and this chore is just so painful to do. Just being creative, I think, is something that you can't go wrong with that, whatever it has to do with.
Well, Sophie, you gave us a bit of a glimpse into the type of activities that you do with people. And I must admit, I'm still guilty of imagining that when you play with food, you're all messy and people throw watermelons at each other, and there's you shoot bananas, you pretend that, that all sorts of things. But what you mentioned, that you tell people to tell stories about the fruits, or sort of...
Exactly.
There are different angles here. Could you tell us a little bit about your favorite activities, or the ones that maybe our listeners could try at home while they are...
Yeah. So there are different approaches that we could take in terms of creating a fun environment around food when it comes to grown-ups and children. But what I realized is that whatever the age, people love open-ended games and activities. Because there is no wrong way to go about this. I started working with children from 7 different nations just before the quarantine. We had a 3-month creative workshop where we used food as a creative context, and basically I helped them learn how to use it as a superpower on and off the table. So what we do with them was that I would introduce a subject, a general topic, for instance, identity. And I would ask them questions like, okay, so how do you know who you are? What does it mean to have an identity? How do you choose how you act, or what values you have? All of this stuff. And then I would give them a bunch of fruits and vegetables and all kinds of nutritious ingredients, natural ingredients. And I would tell them, okay, so create a self-portrait, an edible self-portrait that corresponds to your idea of who you are with what you've got here. But bear in mind, everything must be eaten at the end of this journey. So there's no food can be wasted here. And this would force their minds into a space that was so different from what their traditional classes would require them to do. And at the end of the whole exercise and activity, I could see in their eyes that they had just discovered a bunch of new dots to connect, dots they didn't even know existed before. So that's in terms of what I've done with kids. What I've actually started doing with grown-ups, literally 5 days ago, was that we started creating edible art over Zoom. People from around the world, we got together. Some were enjoying their morning cup of coffee. Some of us were enjoying our evening glass of red wine. And we would literally have this safe virtual playground to connect over food. We would create an edible masterpiece, like take a picture of it so that everybody can brag in front of their friends, and then turn it into a dessert that we then eat, like enjoyed, all of us. And what this did for people was that it gave them an excuse to engage in an activity with no official agenda. Because so many of us have been using Zoom and our laptops to be productive in the past months that we've kind of forgotten how to introduce joy in our lives with the same technology. And I knew I needed to find a way to kind of just give people the license to engage in a frivolous waste of time, if you will. And it turned out this worked like a dynamic meditation practice that gave people much more than I expected it would give them.
So just in general, what's the biggest changes that you see people at the beginning of a workshop, before a glass of wine or before a cup of coffee, not necessarily the wine, but just what's the transformation that's happening on the various levels with the participants in a workshop like this?
I think we can't escape having expectations from a certain activity. So people come in expecting they would do a certain thing, a certain project, and would come out with a certain end result. And this maybe tends to rob people from the ability to just enjoy themselves. And what happens in the course of the workshop is that they realize that, okay, well, I was supposed to do this, but I did something different, but this is still fun. Okay, so there's really no wrong way to do this. Maybe there is just more to this whole area of food than I initially thought. So opening their minds is kind of maybe the end result and what I go for with all those activities.
This is so interesting. What I'm processing in my head now is that, I enjoy making pizza, but I never asked myself why. That's like this is like the thing that's currently being processed in my head, and I think many of us are in the same space where we go, like, we intuitively know that taking 2 hours a day to cook your meal, you probably can't afford it, but there's some sort of a guilty pleasure in it that we tend to avoid because we want to be productive, we want to spend the time in a less unorthodox way, perhaps. I don't really know what this is.
Absolutely.
I'm really interested in the Zoom component because when I was looking at your website and all those wonderful pictures, and you guys have got to see the site. We'll link it in the show notes. So make sure you don't miss out on Sophie's website. It's nothing you've seen before. Warranted. There is a bunch of people, like there's it looks almost like a human body or a skeleton that's made of strawberries and cucumbers and everything. And it really makes some wires in your brain sort of connect and cross. It's amazing what it does to your head. And you mentioned that you had to start doing this over Zoom, right? Because of the pandemic. So I wonder, when did you decide to go online, and what was the journey here?
Well, the journey actually begins much before the pandemic began, because my background has nothing to do with food officially. I have a degree in journalism and in business. I then worked in graphic design, a little bit in PR, and then I had a very successful corporate career in IT, which let me just say, I used to write technical documentation for virtual software, and you can only imagine how well I fit in this environment, and you would not be surprised that I burned out and had panic attacks and suffered a miscarriage and like all of those things that my body was screaming, get out of here, like as soon as you can. But I ignored it because this was the right thing to do. This was what young, successful people did, and I did all that. And I had this like little hobby on the side that had to do with food, and people thought, oh, she's a blogger. She wants to take pictures of pretty food all day long. And I had such a hard time communicating to people that there was so much more to this. And then in 2017, I burned out. I left my corporate job. I got certified as an eating psychology coach, and I decided to jump into social entrepreneurship and kind of started pretending to be an entrepreneur and trying to turn this vision that I had in my mind into something that I can monetize and I can actually make a living out of this. And it took me about 2 years to finally stop outsourcing my sense of worth to my paycheck, which was non-existent. I was working harder than I ever had for no money. And I finally came up with some different frameworks that I could implement. And I started having corporate clients, and I started working with schools, and I had all those things going on. And a few weeks later, the pandemic kicks in. And it's Groundhog Day all over again, and I was forced to pivot again. I was forced to come up with something new again, because my practice, something that I had taken 2 years to develop, was wiped out overnight. And I had no choice. I'm extremely lucky to have my partner support me financially through this crazy journey, but I needed to feel that I'm worth something again. And honestly, right now, that's really not the case. If I can afford to maybe go off script a bit, I am struggling with anxiety and depressive episodes all the time. And even minutes before we started recording, my partner took me out to get some fresh air, because I got overwhelmed by a sense of you should not be doing this. You don't deserve to be doing this. The imposter syndrome was just kind of just all over the place. And a while after the pandemic began, I realized that maybe I should just take some time to stop feeling anxious and overwhelmed again. And I started playing around in the kitchen, and I started creating edible art. And I realized, I shared it actually on a few Facebook groups, and people went nuts. And they started asking whether I sell prints, whether I teach it online, and this and that. And this, basically, I responded to people asking me what do you want to do with it? And that's how it all began. It's still in such an embryonic state that I have no idea if anything's going to come out of this. But yeah, that's the origin story.
Sophie, if I may, I have to tell you one thing. I have to tell you three things, actually. Those of you at home, because we have the privilege of seeing each other on Zoom, most of our listeners will listen through this on the Apple Podcast or Spotify, so they won't be able to see you. Sophie radiates positive energy. She's smiling. This energy is infectious, and she's the first person on our show who used the words such as wipe out, pandemic, smiling while smiling. So yeah, that's one comment. Second thing about the imposter syndrome. Well, that makes three of us now, right? And
yes. Yes. I just want to say, I think every single coach, every single trainer, every single parent has come to a point where you're going one, what am I doing here? And two, why are they listening to me? If I am struggling with this in my own life, if you're having a EQ workshop, or you're having training someone how to have difficult conversations with coworkers, and you're thinking back to the way that you spoke to your coworker half an hour ago, having conversations like that, the vulnerability that you're showing it's vulnerable, but it's true because it's true for everyone. And I have not come across a trainer or a coach or anyone that has put themselves in front of someone that didn't somewhere had that little niggling thing of okay, so what qualifies you to say this? What qualifies you to be the person that people listen to now? And that's a kind of a theme that goes through. And yet we take out the knife, we chop the tomato, and we make the salad, and we go. So thank you for that. Bartosz, you had two more things to say.
One more, actually, because you sort of covered what I wanted to cover as well. But that sort of validates my point of view. So thank you, Louis. So I think my final point here is the idea of this journey and how sort of conscious you are of this, that this is early stages, sort of winging it. And again, our listeners won't be able to see you, but we see how natural you feel in this whole context, which is just so unique and so authentic that it's almost like this hit on the face. You made me question my own career choices, Sophie, and we've only known each other for 14 minutes. No, I'm kidding. I actually love my corporate job. My story is quite reversed. So I started on my own as an entrepreneur, and then I jumped into the corporate world.
You know, the thing, I think there is no wrong or right way to go about this, because as long as you're in unison with your values, as long as your day job, like the thing you pour your heart, your soul, your energy, your curiosity, your talents, your everything, as long as this thing kind of connects with your internal compass, that's fine. For some people, it happens in the corporate world, and that's excellent. For other people, it's out there in the jungle of entrepreneurship, and that's perfect. Doesn't matter, as long as you find like yourself.
So I've got a question with regards to that. I want to know what that blockage is. What's the thing that stops people from taking a corner, to stop them from, in inverted commas, playing with their food, or, being able to step out into the unknown, or doing something different, or approaching a current situation in which they feel stuck, in which they feel burnt out? What's the blockage that's keeping people from actually taking that leap into making edible art, or, quitting that job, or doing whatever that big thing is that they feel needs to be the next step?
I've spent so much time thinking about that. And what I've come to realize is that most of us don't really know who we are beyond the social conditioning and the social roles that we've adopted, just because our environment convinced us that this is what you're supposed to do at this stage of your life. These are the choices that you can make. Okay, it's A, B, or C, but that's it. Like, there's no D or E or F. And we go, like, we tend to live our lives on autopilot, and we just compete in those races and become excellent at stuff that, society promises us would guarantee us success. And then we get there, and there's no sense of success. There's no sense of fulfillment. Essentially, like, the popular culture romanticizes working, 80 hours a week. It romanticizes climbing the corporate ladder and all this stuff. And unless you have a super strong internal, sense of identity, you go with the flow, because that's what people like me do, right? Like, people around me do this stuff, they seem fine, so I might as well just do that. And then so many people hit 30 or 40 or 50 years and they end up thinking, oh crap, what did I do with my life? Like, this is useless. I hate this stuff. Why did I do it? And the reason we don't ask ourselves the question of, is this really my thing, is because it's scary. The answer is often scary. The answer often requires you to take 180 and completely change the direction and start over and lose your identity. Because honestly, I was the youngest senior technical writer in my entire organization globally, and I was excellent at something that I hated from the bottom of my heart. Not because there was anything wrong with the job, but because I wanted to do something different. I wanted to leave work and create value for people that lasts, that helps them connect with their children, or build a relationship with their spouse, or unleash their inner artist, or heal a wound that, they had when they were 12 years old, or whatever. And virtual software is great. But this wasn't the game I wanted to play. And I realized I was winning other people's races, and my ladder was leaning against the wrong building. And no matter how successful I got, I would never feel happy.
So what's the question? What's the question that we should ask if we have a listener sitting there listening to Sophie going like, I hear you, sister. I am stuck in a job. I am doing something in my corporate, in my entrepreneurship, whatever the case might be. I'm in a place right now where I don't feel fulfillment, where I don't feel success. What's the question, or what's the first step to take just to be able to take a turn in that specific situation?
Honestly, I have read pretty much all the books that I managed to find on that topic over the course of the past several years, and I've listened to like so many podcasts and lectures and TED Talks and whatnot, and I keep going back to one simple thing that we don't really pay attention to, because again, we are not conditioned to believe that the stuff we enjoy and the stuff we have fun doing could be the stuff we do for a living, or the stuff that, become the center of our business or whatever. So the thing I keep asking people is, what gets you into flow? Like, where do you use yourself? What is the thing that you can spend hours upon hours of doing and just not realizing that time passes because you are one with it, because it's coming through you? And here's where a lot of people get confused and start searching for the passion, quote unquote. And the reason I mention that is because the thing that gives me meaning and sense of purpose was not a passion of mine. It was at the intersection of the two things that made me feel the worst about myself: my lack of sense of smell and my eating disorder. But it was at the intersection of those two features where this unique lens was conceived, the lens through which I can view reality in a different way from people. So that's what I go back to, go back to having fun. Go back to doing the stuff that you would do if nobody paid you. And there's no shortcuts. I'm 5 years later, I'm still literally flat broke. Thanks to my partner, I'm able to do this. But this, how every overnight success takes 10 years to get to. It's a journey, and the truly long game takes time to set up.
We both can relate to this because our podcast is pretty much a flow journey. We decided to do it once. We sort of enjoy doing this, and there's zero profit in it. So in case you guys want to advertise, I'm kidding. We probably wouldn't take any ads anyway. We probably wouldn't care to do advertising. All we really want to do is contribute. And I agree with you. Most success stories start usually with a slap on the face or a hit on the wrist, or a dramatic set of circumstances like yours. And then there is a sense of consistency and sort of building on top of what you've discovered and adding that value and making and doing something for the people where you can transform this into a business idea or something like that. But I really appreciate what you've built so far. And you guys, you have to visit. It's foodieboulevard.com. And you will find the link in the show notes because you will be blown away. Personal guarantee of mine. Okay.
So, Sophie, I would like to know, for all our listeners at home listening to the podcast, thinking about, what's for dinner, what's for lunch today, do you have something that they can do during dinner tonight just to kind of spice things up? And I'm not necessarily talking about curry. Just, is there something they can do to approach the food that they're making today just a little bit differently?
Yeah. So one thing that we haven't touched upon is the journey before making sense of everything in my head. And the journey was something that started in a small studio apartment that had no kitchen. It had a super tiny sink in the bathroom, and that was that. I had just moved to the capital city. I was pretending to be a grown-up and had to feed myself. There were nobody around me to cook for me, and I was making very little money, and I had to pay off student debts and all this stuff. And I bought the cheapest food processor I could find and started making myself some creamy soups with it. And fast forward 5 years, I had realized that creative cooking was actually the operating system that had allowed me to cultivate this sense of creativity that I then applied to everything I did. So how this all ties together is that I gradually developed this framework for creating delicious and nutritious meals from scratch without following recipes, without stressing out about proportions, amounts, ingredients, and this and that, and just thinking on the spot and kind of puzzling together ingredients as if they were like Lego bricks, essentially. And this is what the other thing that I've been teaching people, and I actually just released the first digital course, which is in Bulgarian, but it teaches people exactly how to come up with their own recipes depending on what they have in the fridge, so that they don't have to go to the store, they don't have to search for recipes online and this and that. And one thing that I always tell people to do is just open the fridge. Provided that there is some whole foods there and not just
So not a student fridge. Most refrigerators of students.
Frozen lasagna. Yes. But basically treat the ingredients literally as if they were Lego bricks. Because with the same 5 ingredients, you could create 5 completely different meals, depending on how you kind of prepare them and whether you bake them or boil them or this or that. And I know it sounds pretty abstract, but I came up with these, I call them magic equations, that basically tell you, okay, so if you want to make pancakes, you got to use something dry, like a dry ingredient, a liquid ingredient, a sticky ingredient. And for the dry ingredient, you can pick one of those 10 different options. For the second one, it's the same thing. And for the third one, it's the same thing. And basically it teaches you how to be the architect of your own meal in a simple way. And it takes, it's a mouthful to explain, but once you get it, you never need to use a cookbook ever again.
Wow, I want that. I need to learn Bulgarian, though, to access this course.
Well, I'll hopefully create the same thing in English, because I think this is one thing that many people can benefit from right now, because literally I've had people stressed out that they need to go to the store, and I can simplify that in such a simple way that I feel obliged to do that.
I think at some level, anyone can relate to this, right? And we have listeners in so many countries around the world. Some of them are complete food deserts. So greetings to our listeners in the US. Right? And some of them are famous for this sort of family organized cooking. So greetings to all of you in India and the Bay of Bengal. We have people over there as well. But I think everyone can relate to the fact that you get to the store and you're like, do I have canned potatoes or something?
Exactly.
There's no such thing as canned potatoes. It tells you how good I am with the food. Anyway, so if you're the architect of your food platter, and you mentioned there are some ingredients that you use as Legos to create these recipes, are there any Legos that you would absolutely avoid and just completely remove from any kitchen?
So this is another thing that I've been researching a lot. And I actually did a TEDx talk a couple of years ago on the myths about healthy eating, because there is this stigma that forbids people from eating this or eating that. And if you are just starting out and trying to cultivate healthy eating habits, you can lose yourself and go down the rabbit hole and just come out of it completely overwhelmed and just say, I'm not gonna even try to do that. There's just so much to take into account. And the thing I was really kind of relieved to learn was that a few years ago in the Institute for Sciences in Weizmann, I think it was called, this person, Professor Eran Segal, I think was his name, ran an experiment where he followed close to between 800 and 1,000 people and followed their diet, and they were essentially eating the same foods, both whole foods, nutritious and all that, and then junk stuff, all kinds of it. And what the results that came out of the experiment were extremely surprising, because it turns out that there is no single perfect diet and like a set list of ingredients that affects every single human being the exact same way. We are completely different. We have evolved in different ways depending on where we were born and where we grew up. So basically, the rule of thumb is choose as much as you can fresh, local, seasonal ingredients, consume them in as pure form as possible, meaning try not to deep fry and all this stuff, and just keep reminding yourself that balance is a dynamic state, and no extreme, whether it's in eating or exercising or whatever, no extreme works in the long run, because we cannot sustain the same level of effort if that effort is more than we can take. So as long as you make the best choice that particular day in that particular situation, this is the long game. And this is not it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. So cultivating sustainable healthy eating habits that last is the key to basically optimizing your health and your longevity. And this is what I always go back to. Do it as simple as possible. And the more color you have on your plate from natural ingredients, basically the better.
This always brings me back when we're having conversations. One of the things that Bartosz and I have deep conversations about is the intentionality to be intentional, is to really be front of mind with what you're doing. It's not to take the automatic reaction of letting your car drive to McDonald's, but to take the time and to say, what am I putting into my body? What am I spending my time on? How am I building my relationships? How am I, advancing my career through the choices I'm making today? Sophie, thank you so much for all the insights that you've shared today. I think there's a lot to chew on. We had a mouthful, and even though the stakes are low...
That is such a bad pun, Louis.
Yes, Bartosz, I went for all the food references.
Okay, but that's why we have post-production. We can remove those things.
Thank you, Sophie, so much for being with us today and sharing just from your expertise. Is there anything else that you would like to leave with us or leave with our listeners?
Well, thank you guys for having me. I think we covered a lot of ground, and I hope people come out of this asking themselves, what is it about food that I still don't know? And what else can I take from it that I've never searched for?
Some deep thoughts to be left with.
And finally, please tell us, where can we find you? Where do we follow you?
So actually, the website that you saw is a baby website. It was born literally a couple of months ago, and it's still work in progress. But if people go to foodieboulevard.com, they can find out what we do. We are a tiny team of hopeful entrepreneurs. I have a co-founder who is helping me just grow this stuff, and people can see what we do on Facebook and Instagram, and I'm also on LinkedIn, and I'm also always open to just giving people a direction if they are stuck and don't know where to begin. So feel free to reach out.
Sophie, just to throw back to what Bartosz said earlier about the Zoom classes. What are the Zoom classes? Who might be interested? What are you offering? How big a group should I bring? What's the setup? What should the preparation be? How much wine is involved? Just some of the basics about that. Please.
Wonderful question. So we just finished the first test run of the Zoom experience, which was basically a 7-day Bring Delicious Joy to Your Life challenge, where people would get an email a day, and it would include some food for thought, some questions like, what does childhood taste like? Or what does heavy metal taste like? And stuff like that, things they can do without necessarily getting in the kitchen, and then some creative cooking, adaptable recipe ideas, and some edible art ideas. And then the entire journey culminates with a 2-hour workshop on a Sunday, usually, where people know exactly what stuff they need, the list of ingredients and all that. And we literally spend 2 hours just having an excuse to not do anything with an agenda, creating edible art, turning it into something delicious, but just being there for each other. It was about 10 of us, and it's a space for people from around the globe to just connect and have safe fun at home in the midst of this madness that is actually offering us a space to grow that can equip us for the next era, because whether we like it or not, post-COVID reality is a whole new ballgame, and we need new skills to thrive in that.
Well, Sophie, you've just reminded me that my childhood tastes like a slice of freshly baked bread with butter and sugar on top of it. So thank you so much for putting that memory back in my head. Ladies and gentlemen, Sophie Yotova, and you can find all the links in the show notes below. Thank you. We just had a conversation with Sophie, who is a food artist, a coach, and she does wonderful things, running workshops, reimagining the ways we interact with food. I wonder, what are your key takeaways, no pun intended, from this show?
I think one of the things that really struck me about our conversation with Sophie is how everyday things has the value we give to it. And if we take time to think about our food and what it actually means, it opens up new ways of thinking about life. If we are intentional about the way we plan our lives, plan our meals, how we take the time that we actually have now with COVID and actually just take the time to create something, there's something new that comes to the fore. It's not just being stuck in that rut of, takeaway or, defrosting food, but really taking that opportunity to be creative. And the best thing about being creative is it gets messy, and messy isn't bad. It's just messy. And to take that liberty and saying, let's get messy. Let's play around. Let's experiment. Let's try something new that might just be a whole new way of thinking about a bunch of things in our lives. So I was really, really, there's a lot of things I'm going to take away from our conversation with Sophie. I think the one thing that stood out for me is where she said balance is a dynamic state. And I think that's the thing that if we're talking about the way to approach life, it is in balance. There's a balance between work and life and family and health and food, but that all of that is in a dynamic floating state. And we need to embrace that without getting seasick, to say the least. Boris, what was your takeaways?
I'd like to start with the whole context of food and the way we perceive it, because Sophie connects so many different disciplines together into this one way of looking at food through play, which is a completely unique thing. I've never seen anything like this before. Of course, I've seen dietitians, I've seen people do cooking workshops, cookery lessons, all sorts of things, but nobody really connected those ideas holistically like she did. And I really appreciate that about her point of view. And I think she's super strong in creating this narrative. What I mean by this, she had quite a dramatic start into this career, which you can't really call career now. It's like an idea she's looking after and nourishing into something wonderful and absolutely unique. So I'm really interested to see how this business develops. She definitely gained a new fan. But what is most important for me is the way she reframes our relationship with the food that we put on our plates, right? I'm never going look at my plate the same way like I did before, for sure. So that's a huge takeaway for me. And the whole interview with her seemed like a big mindfulness exercise for me, for which I'll be eternally grateful to Sophie for her generosity.
So for me, I think the one thing that she said is more color is always good. So on our plates, in our lives, in our conversations, more color is always good. Thank you for the listener for spending your time with us. We hope that you're getting value from our conversations as we talk to the people that are making the meetings inside the room amazing meetings. From South Africa, this is Louis saying goodbye.
And from Poland, this is Bartosz signing off. Bye.
Bye.
you'd like to participate in our show, drop us a line at ask@amazingmeetings.org. That's ask@amazingmeetings.org. You can also find us on LinkedIn. This is pretty much where we are these days, so follow us on LinkedIn. This is where we upload our episode snippets and all sorts of goodies. So see you around and take care. Bye-bye.